Good evening. My name is Joan Goodman and I work with the JTS Development Office. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this special webinar called Rare Treasures of the JTS Library with Dr. David Kramer. This webinar is one of the ways we show our appreciation to our synagogues and their congregants for supporting our JTS Friends campaign. Your generous support allows us to produce innovative, exceptional Jewish leaders, rabbis and chazanim, Jewish educators, academics, and community leaders. Now, a program outline for tonight. After I share a short biography about Dr. Kramer, he will speak for approximately 40 minutes. He will then answer as many of your questions as time will allow, so please email your questions using the link on your screen or to onlinelearning@jtsa.edu. Now, Dr. David Kramer, Joseph J. and Dora Abel librarian and professor of Talmud and Rabbinics, has been part of the JTS community since 1977, when he enrolled in the graduate school after completing his undergraduate degree at Brandeis. He began teaching as a graduate student in 1980 and received his PhD in 1984. He accepted the position as head of the library in 2004 and has since played a crucial role in forging policy and expanding the impact of the library's world-renowned collections and programs. He is especially excited to be overseeing the planning of the opening of the new JTS library, which is planned to open its doors in the fall of 2019. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Kramer.
Hi, welcome. It's my pleasure, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's my pleasure to be with you. It's been a while since I've done a rare book room tour. So even though we're limited to doing it only digitally, I have to tell you that my purpose tonight is twofold. First, I want to seduce you. The seduction is with the works that I'm going to show you. I want you to begin to appreciate. My hope is that I can help you begin to appreciate some of the most wonderful qualities of these works in the JTS Libraries collection. We have got the largest collection of rare Judaica in the world. And every single item is quite extraordinary in its own way. I've selected some of the most beautiful, provocative, telling items. And again, I want to seduce you into thinking that this is something that I need to be part of my life. And if I persuade you of that, then you will accept my invitation, because I also want to invite you, when we open the new library in 2019, the fall semester of 2019, to think about coming to visit us, because we want to activate this collection with groups of all sorts. And if you get in touch with me at that time, with any of our staff, we'll be happy to talk about a visit to see some of the materials I'm going to show you tonight, as well as other materials. The collection, as I say, is vast, and there's always something new to discover, something new to learn. So let's go straight to the collection. Do we have that on screen? We do, good. So you've got an image in front of you. This will be the first of several for this work, and in the end we're going to be looking at about a dozen works. Everything that I'm going to show you is a manuscript, as is this in front of you. And if you look at it carefully, you'll note that in addition to a dirty page, dirty pages are always the front and back pages of any manuscript we have, because of course they're the ones that are exposed to the world most frequently. For those of you who are able to read the Hebrew, you'll recognize this as an early part, but certainly not the beginning, of our Passover Haggadah. This is a Haggadah that we call the Prado Haggadah. It was produced in Spain in about the year 1300. And for those of you who know something about rare Haggadahs, you may have heard of, you might have read about something called the Sarajevo Haggadah. This Haggadah in our collection comes from precisely the same tradition. In fact, the artistic tradition is very, very similar in the two Haggadahs. The difference is that someone wrote a novel about the Sarajevo Haggadah, so you probably know about that and not about this one. Essentially, though, you're looking at the same thing. Look carefully at the page. And you'll notice a number of things. It is abundantly decorated. It's got beautiful gold leaf. It begins, and as I said, this is the first page of the Haggadah, with a section of the Seder that some of you will recognize as halach ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Anyone who's in need should come and eat. Why is this the first page of the Haggadah? Because, and you see this in this manuscript, you'll see it in others, and even in early printed Haggadot, they thought of what came before this invitation, which is immediately before the four questions, as the beginning of the Seder proper. Before this, you said a blessing or two, recited Kiddush, ate a few vegetables, but the actual telling, the invitation for the telling, begins here. And so remarkably, it's precisely when we open our doors and invite the poor in to our Seder that our tradition, considers the Seder to have begun. Look at the bottom, in the kind of busiest part of the decoration. What do you see there? If you look very, very carefully, both right and left, you'll see small images. The image on the right of your screen, if you're looking carefully, is a hound, and the image on the left is a deer. What are we doing with images of animals on the front page of a Haggadah? Well, when we turn pages in this Haggadah, and there are many pages, as you would expect, these animals and other animals show up on other pages as well. There's a traditional explanation for why these animals appear here, and it is the beginning of a hunt, of a chase. I don't accept the traditional explanations because we see the same animals actually in Christian manuscripts of the same period. And so what becomes clear is two possibilities. A, that this is just simply the way Jews living in Spain in about the year 1300, as well as their Christian neighbors, thought of decorating their manuscripts. This, by the way, was in the region of Catalonia, that is to say, near Barcelona. The other possibility, though, and I think that in the case of the Haggadah, this is more likely than anything else, the reason we've got the beginning of a chase is because, think about it, this is a manuscript. It's before the age when we could print books, and so how many Haggadahs would be at any Seder table? Well, this was a wealthy family. We know that because they produced a beautiful gold-decorated Haggadah, but still the likelihood is that only the leader of the Seder had a Haggadah to work with. How did he keep the children interested? The answer is by having a game in the Haggadah. And so the chase begins on this page, and on more or less every other page, the game will continue. And the children learn that every time the page will be turned, they should jump up and come and see it till they get to what in this Haggadah is a surprise ending. Now, every manuscript, and here I'm going to step out for a moment, when you think of rare books and manuscripts, you probably think of the musty, dusty world of scholars. And to be sure, that's the way we here at the Jewish Theological Seminary thought about our rare collections for too many years. This was the realm of scholars. But there's a lot to learn here that goes beyond the limited interests of scholars. And in fact, manuscripts in particular have far more than words, as you can see on the 2 pages I've shown you just up to this point. And from the images, not from the words, but from the images, from the accidents of the quality of paper, the ink, many, many other things that we find here, we learn more about the lives of Jews and their neighbors than we do in the words on the page. And so here you've got the first of the 4, we call them in our world children, but of course in this age nobody thought to equalize it to include girls. And so the first of the 4 sons. Those of you who can read the Hebrew, you can see here in the beautiful gold, very, very prominently featured on the page. This is the Chacham, that is to say the wise son. And I can ask you the question very simply, what makes this son wise? Well, obviously he's got a book on his lap, and that was unusual in that age. Scholars The Y's and books are obviously associated. He's got his other hand raised in instruction. But interestingly, if you were to see this image and I were to ask you, if it were separated from the manuscript, does this look like a good Jewish boy to you? Your answer would be, well, not exactly, because what we discover over and over again from these manuscripts is how Jews really lived, not how the rabbis describe them as having lived, but the actual cultural sharing, the broader culture in which Jews participated. And we're going to see that over and over again. Here we've got a wonderful page from this same Haggadah. It's an unfinished page, and one of the remarkable features of this manuscript, of this Haggadah, is that it is unfinished. The reason that's important is because it allows us to learn something about the process, the procedures of creating beautiful illuminated manuscripts. Notice how there's sketching out of the design. You've got parts that, the people right and left around what in fact is, as again, those of you who recognize the Hebrew, this is a particularly extravagant matzah, I guess we would describe it as. A very funky matzah. I wouldn't want to try to sink my teeth into it, but I'll tell you I would love to own it because it would clearly be worth a lot of money. In any case, though, you can see this is an unfinished page. This manuscript actually was loaned to the Metropolitan Museum of Art just a few years ago when they did an exhibit on medieval manuscripts. And one of the questions that exhibit asked was, how were these manuscripts produced? This manuscript, this Haggadah in our collection, is one of the best ways, one of the best samples we have for answering that question. In any case, again, look very carefully at the two individuals who are holding up this matzah in order to illustrate it. If you look carefully, look at the way they're dressed. First of all, I'll ask the question, are these males or females? Right? Are they Jews or not Jews? Both of those are fair questions because if we think about the way we've been taught to analyze these things, we notice, well, first of all, they're wearing long flowing skirts or robes. Their hair is below their ears, certainly. Their heads are not covered. And so a fair guess from the perspective of our prejudice would be young women. These are, in fact, however, two probably young men, and Jewish men dressed and looked like everyone around them in medieval Christian Europe, which is what Barcelona and environs was during this period. Jews did not yet worry about covering their heads, as later pious Jews did, and there's no reason to believe that these young men are not pious, and they dressed just like everybody around them. There's much more we could notice in the details here and elsewhere, but I want to make sure that we have a good view of the collection to come. Here, you can immediately see that we're in a different manuscript. It's very, very tight writing, and it's a text unlike the Haggadah that we just saw, the text of which, right, the words of which are of great interest. This turns out to be what is arguably the most important because it is the earliest and most complete example we have of the record of the practice of Ashkenazi Jews in the Middle Ages. It comes from the school of Rashi. It's from his immediate descendants, and what it records for us, as I say, is the practices that had begun to develop in Ashkenaz, which is during that period North Central Europe, ranging between Paris in the far west and into the Rhineland, today part of Western Germany, in the eastern part of what was then Ashkenaz. And there's much we can learn from this. The name of the work is the Machzor Vitri, and as I said, this is the most important manuscript of the Machzor Vitri that exists. Look at the page, though. Right? There are a lot of words here. Even if you don't understand the words, there's something worth noticing. In the bottom left, it looks almost like it was stamped on the page, though in this case it is not a stamp. It was drawn in by hand in ink. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that as a very common French national decorative symbol. It is a fleur-de-lis. And the fleur-de-lis, which has ancient roots in France, well, how ancient? It goes back just to a couple of generations before this manuscript, which is roughly 1200. It became a symbol of French royalty in the century or two before this manuscript was produced. And now the question becomes, in this important Jewish manuscript, why in the world do we have a sign, a symbol, representing French royalty? An important question, and one that I will intentionally not answer yet, because there's other evidence that we can provide from this very same manuscript. This is a page from somewhere in the middle of this very thick book. And for those of you who can read Hebrew, you'll see that the top line says in a funny way, but if you look at the large scale letters, Eliezer, then Ber, as in Berebi, the son of Shmu, and then it goes to the next line, Shmuel, Eliezer, the son of Shmuel, Chazak v'nit chazek. If you look a little bit more carefully at your screen, you'll notice that these large letters forming large words, and this is the name of the scribe, those large letters actually are themselves composed of much smaller letters. This is called micrography, and it is the one form of medieval artistic creation that we can call, in a genuine and unapologetic way, Jewish art. This is a form of art that Jews did not borrow from others. It originated in Jewish circles, and we find it in many manuscripts. You'll see other examples of this as we go forward from our collection. But let's go to what's at the bottom here. It would be hard to describe this as art. It's more sketching than anything else. But someone thought it important to take pen, quill, and ink to, in this case, not paper but parchment, and to draw some interesting pictures. So let's do it from right to left. On the right, you've got two, I guess they look like peacocks. That's the way most people looking at them identify them. And I call them actually my lovebirds because I love the way they're kissing one another. Then you go to the left, and we seem to have something like a hunting scene. So in the triangle to the left, on the top right, you've got a man on horseback with sword drawn. On the bottom, you've got someone blowing a horn. I think it's unfair to call it a shofar, although it could be made of any animal horn. And then on the top left, you'll notice you've got someone wielding an axe, but not to chop wood. The axe is directed at a deer, probably to kill that deer for consumption. I think it's fair to describe that as a hunting scene. The horn, of course, being part of the hunting ritual, and it continued to be that from medieval times all the way through modernity, and in royal circles even still today, in Britain, for example. What is this all about? Why is this on the page? What does this have to do with Jewish practice? The answer is, if you think about it not too long even, nothing. It has nothing whatsoever to do with Jewish practice. So the question becomes, why is it here in this book, which is devoted to Jewish practice? The answer has to be something like the scribe or some friend artist thought that it would be fun to decorate this, because decoration is an important part of books when books are so valuable. If you don't have a fine artist whom you can hire, you nevertheless decorate the books. The decoration here, though, does something very much like what we saw before. So again, back to the fleur-de-lis. I now go to the next one, back to the hunting scene. We see once again how these Jewish scribes are so much a part of medieval French culture. That's what we see declared here on the page in truly remarkable ways. And this manuscript is probably one of our best examples in our collection of the way we learn of Jews participating fully in the surrounding culture in ways that are quite unexpected and we wouldn't know of from the printed latter-day books that we have in most of our modern libraries. We have to go back to the manuscripts to discover this. So here is one of the last pages. You can see it's marked here. 13th century here is probably a little bit late. I located it about 1200, but so early 13th century at the latest. You see how on the right there is a shift in the nature of the writing. Again, you don't have to be able to read a single word to see some of the way the writing affects what's being written. So at the top right column, we've got the end of a description of the Jewish wedding ceremony according to the traditions of medieval Jews here, medieval Ashkenazi Jews, Jews in France. Below that, and you can see the larger words, and if you read Hebrew, you may recognize that as El Givat, then the words go to the style of these medieval scribes, so it'll be more difficult for you to read because it's a different kind of writing. But El Givat HaLevona is the name of this, written a little bit larger than the directions that come above. And as it turns out, after the description of the ceremony for the wedding, what we learn is that you've got to have a good party after the wedding, meaning after the ceremony of the wedding is over. And so they illustrate the party by including here a medieval French Jewish wedding song. That's what we've got in beginning with the words El Givat, medieval Jewish French wedding song. And I'm going to read to you the first two lines of this song. Listen carefully, even if you don't understand the Hebrew, you're going to notice something as I read. El Givat HaLevona, Notre Chassan it arrivé. Right? Now the first part of that, for those of you who have an ear for Hebrew, you'll recognize as Hebrew. But the last four words of what I read, chassan, I pronounced it in Ashkenazi pronunciation, that is a Hebrew word, but Notre Chassan it arrivé is obviously not a Hebrew phrase, but rather it's in French. Right? It goes back to the Latin, of course, but here we've got 12th century French. And if we were to continue through this wedding song, we would find that line after line, it goes back and forth between Hebrew and French and Hebrew and French and Hebrew and French. What is this about? This form is known where you mix languages like that. It's actually called a macaronic poem. What they're imagining is a strand of spaghetti going back and forth, left to right to left, in almost an S. Here it's all written in Hebrew letters, but the French is the second language. This poem has been carefully studied, and what we've learned is that it's got to be studied with what we used to call when we were teenagers a dirty mind. By that I mean there is a double entendre that extends throughout the entire poem, which, as a wedding poem, therefore anticipating the wedding night, is all about sex and conquest. And conquest here means sexual conquest. Interestingly, the most sexually suggestive parts of this poem are the Hebrew. And much of the Hebrew, by the way, is quotation from biblical passages like the Song of Songs, right? So if you read them properly, or biblical passages that describe swords being drawn and things like that, and you can use your Freudian training to interpret that. But again, the Hebrew is far more explicit or suggestive, and the French we would describe as more romantic. The question is, why does the Hebrew take the tone and the direction it does, and the French tone it down? What seems to be the case is that men are more likely to have understood Hebrew than were women, that is to say, Ashkenazi Jews living in medieval France. And so to protect the sensibilities of the women, the French part of this poem was kept merely romantic. The Hebrew part, on the other hand, which was more accessible to the men, wound up being something like what we would call locker room jokes, though I don't like that phrase all that much. What we have to imagine then, and here, look at what we learn about what was going on in medieval France. We've got a party. People are drinking. The men are reciting or hearing part of this song, and they're laughing out loud. And the women who don't understand what they're laughing at, of course, are going to their husbands or to their companions and saying, "What are you laughing at?" And you've got the great complexity of gender interplay and sexuality all lived in a very real way amongst pious Jews. We shouldn't imagine our pious ancestors as somehow prudish. This is one fabulous example of the very opposite, and believe me, it's not the only example. Here, we stay in the same century, roughly, and we jump a little bit further east, still in Ashkenaz, to what is, and when you come, I hope we'll be able to show this to you, an absolutely magnificent manuscript. The earlier examples I showed you were relatively modest in size, meaning length and width, although they might have been quite thick books. This is an immense book. It's what's called a folio in terms of its size. And the reason I emphasize that is because here you've got an important transitional page as you can see, this is a Machzor. It's from Esslingen, Germany, finished in 1290. It's a high holiday prayer book. Machzor doesn't ordinarily mean high holiday prayer book when we use it to describe manuscripts, but in this case, it is a high holiday prayer book. Again, when we ask ourselves the question, how many people sitting in the pews and the seats of a medieval synagogue in this trade town called Esslingen, how many of them would have had prayer books on their laps to be able to read along and pray? The answer is very few of the wealthy. Instead, the congregation would have sat around the central reader's desk, with this huge book on it, and this page would have been exposed. And even if they understood very little Hebrew at all, they would have seen one very, very big word in the middle, melech, king, and around it they would have seen the king's palace. And this would have announced the central theme of Rosh Hashanah. It would have been, in other words, a lesson in the meaning of Rosh Hashanah, where we enact the notion that God is king. So this is not a text in the normal way we think about it. It responds to the needs of the community as a whole in a way that enables them to see the way we would use audiovisual aids. And it's that alone where the artist and the scribe bring them in, instruct them, and bring them forward into the themes of the day. Here's another page from the same Machzor. And I have to say, I love it. There are many pages of this. This is, again, one of these medieval poems which is used for the high holidays alone. Some of you will know this, Imru Elohim. But notice the way it's decorated. This would not be inappropriate as the source for an announcement for the new season of Game of Thrones. The dragons you can see quite clearly, and I'll ask the question again, although already you should be anticipating the answer. What are dragons doing in a high holiday prayer book? And the answer is decorating the prayer book. Right? Nothing more. There is no place for dragons in a Jewish work as such. But of course, once again, we see this is the Gothic period when we talk about the culture. Obviously, dragons were in everybody's imagination. And when you look at the decorations of churches and Christian manuscripts, and here you can see Jewish manuscripts as well, dragons literally inform the entire environment. And so a Jew living in this time and place would have participated in the broad culture by bringing the dragon in, and here literally into this community prayer book that would have sat in the middle of the synagogue in Esslingen. Here we're in the same period. I kept this in chronological order. This goes back to what I showed you before in the signature of the scribe, a beautiful Bible, what's called the Masoretic Bible. The name of this that we've given is the Micrographic Bible, because once again, you can see in the decoration the way it uses this Jewish art form, using small letters to create images, to beautify the work. And again, if you look carefully, you'll find foxes and dogs and deer and the like. nature comes into culture without any kind of division whatsoever. And here, again, the beauty of the book, something that as print yielded to mass production print, we've forgotten. Jews wanted their books, as everybody else, I might add, to be beautiful. Here we jump to Italy. This is an early page, one of the first pages, and again, it's from a Haggadah, Halach Ma'anya, some of you will recognize. This is a Haggadah which was created by one of the greatest scribe artists of the Renaissance in this case. This is the Italian Renaissance. This manuscript is from 1454. Actually an interesting life story for the scribe here. He describes himself elsewhere in this manuscript. His name is Yoel ben Shimon. And he tells us that his name where he came from, and he's from Ashkenaz, was Favush. He had a Yiddish name and a Hebrew name. The reason I show you this particular page is because it's enticing to ask ourselves, what is this image in front of us? Since it's the Halach Ma'anya page, this is the bread of affliction, the temptation is to see this as a piece of matzah, although if we recognize that matzah was not yet mass-produced, meaning it was difficult to actually create square matzah with rows of holes in it, which is what we're accustomed to seeing at our tables, this is unlikely to be matzah at all. But instead, when you look at it carefully, it's clearly decoration, and part of the decoration is many, many different heads. Look at them carefully, right? You've got bald gentlemen with bare heads, gentlemen with covered heads. You've got, in several places, a person wearing a bear costume. That's in the second row, 3 from the left. There's a lot to see here, quite remarkably. As I said, a few have their heads covered, but many do not. If you look below the central blue panel, you've got someone whose face you can't even see because he's wearing a helmet of, full body armor. Why are these images here? Right? Well, because what are we doing at this point? You're inviting the community into the Seder, and the community means in the broadest sense. So what we see here is, what did Jews really look like in probably northern Italy in the 15th century? And the answer is, they looked like what we've got in front of you. Quite unlike, again, that pious image that we expect. I want to show you a couple of other examples of this. This is a small book. We've expanded the image. You can see it's from northern Italy, 1471. We know from the last pages of this prayer book that it was written by a very famous scribe whose name was Avram Farisol, and it was written as a wedding gift to be given by a groom to his bride on the occasion of their wedding. So you can see that the circles on this page have been scratched out. They were intentionally scratched out. This is not something that happened just through a lot of use, because you can see that whatever the damage is on the rest of the page, the circles are emptied, and in the bottom somebody wrote in Shema Yisrael. We ask ourselves, what was originally on this page? If we look at the circle to the right, got blue at the top, and if your screens allow you to see it carefully enough, some green remains on the bottom. Anyone in first grade who was ever in first grade knows that blue at the top and green at the bottom means landscape. What we imagine is that this was originally a portrait of the woman, the privileged Jewish woman, right? We know she must have been privileged because of the worth of this manuscript, even in its own age. She was literate, so she needed a prayer book. Interestingly, as a woman, she prayed. There was no assumption that she would be excluded from that. So she's educated. She participates in religious education. And some later owner of this eliminated her image because he probably thought it's inappropriate to have an image of a woman in your prayer book. There's another page in the prayer book. You're probably not going to be able to read this because it's in a script, but if you look very carefully, these are the morning blessings. On the right, you've got abbreviation for Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam, right? So the beginning of a blessing, and then, I don't know, in the middle of the blessings, slightly before the mid-break, the blessing that A man would say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, for not making me a woman." And as far as you know, if you know this anywhere at all, from traditional prayer books, a woman would say, "Blessed are you, God, for making me according to your will," which is a kind of begrudging, okay, you couldn't have done better, but in any case, that's the traditional blessing. Here in 1471, this privileged young woman said, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, sha'asitani isha v'lo ish." Thank you for making me a woman and not a man. We would not have known about such a bold statement from the Italian Renaissance, Jews living in 15th century Italy, unless we had this manuscript. Now, as you can see, this is not from our collection, but I wanted to include it so you can see what else or how far manuscripts can bring us. So this is from the British Library, but is once again a prayer book manuscript written by hand in Renaissance Italy. We know who wrote it and who it was written for. And lo and behold, we've got here a woman who is reciting the Borei Priagafen part of the Havdalah service at the end of Shabbat. Look at the way she's dressed. Look at the way her hair is dressed, brought up. If I were to give you this image and not show you the Hebrew letters on the right, ask you where does it come from, you would say this is from perhaps even royalty from some medieval context. If you knew a little bit more, you might even guess at Italy. And what we can see is that this pious Jewish woman living in Italy at this time reciting Havdalah. So again, it's women doing things that in other settings we have learned should not have been the case, but in fact, women did do these things. We also see how much Jews participated in the broader culture. Here, she's doing the vidui. She's praying on the high holidays, bending in order to confess her sins. Quite astounding. One more manuscript here, and our most beautiful, most valuable manuscript. We call it the Rothschild Machzor. It was written for a noble Jewish family. Nobility during the Renaissance is a funny thing because, there was no official nobility for Jews. But imagine the wealth behind this. Here's Moses at Mount Sinai. Look at the way the Jews standing at the foot of Mount Sinai are dressed, right? Like Renaissance Italians of all sorts. This is another page from the Machzor, just beautiful. Another, look at the angel here. This is the kind of thing that you expect to find in Christian manuscripts, but is every bit as much present in Jewish manuscripts as any other. Again, another beautiful, beautiful page. There are actually 4 workshops of artists who created this manuscript. That's the wealth that's behind this. That's the nobility that the Jewish family felt that it had. This is just from a few years later, again in Italy. Look at the Jewish family. This is once again a Haggadah gathered around the table at the bottom. You would hardly recognize them for their Jewishness, even though it is a Seder table. Here you've got a Jewish man, head uncovered, wearing Italian Renaissance dress, holding up the bitter herbs. Right? I'm jumping a little bit here, 1675. This is an Italian Megillah. This is a Megillah for Purim, the scroll of Esther. Would we expect to find the nude torso of a woman in a scroll of Esther, which could be used for liturgical purposes? The answer is, well, not in an Ashkenazi synagogue, we wouldn't. But once again, Italy had different sensibilities. My time before questions is coming to an end, so I just want to quickly show you a couple more things. This is the same Megillah. This is a manuscript written by Jews who might or might not have been converted to Islam from Persia in 1853, and it shows us a legend that was valued both by Muslims and Jews. It's the story of Joseph, the biblical Joseph, Yusuf in Arabic, and his love affair with the wife of Potiphar from the biblical story. And so here is Potiphar's wife chasing after Joseph. Again, notice the dress. What's remarkable about this story is that the version of the Joseph story in this manuscript is identical with the one told in in Islamic mysticism, which itself is based upon the version in the Quran, which itself is identical to the version of the Joseph story in the rabbinic midrash. This is the way these cultures went back and forth. Last but not least, you've got here a very, very simple manuscript. It's actually written on paper that you could buy. We would describe this as a corner stationery store. This would have been, the kind of store you would go to buy general supplies and the like. And under ordinary circumstances, it's on slightly blue paper, but a merchant would have bought this book to keep his books, or it could have served as a diary. Well, there was a Jew, probably relatively poor, living in this case in Baghdad in 1875, who created this as their Haggadah. Again, it's a Haggadah, and look carefully. You've got on the right a decorated page that is indistinguishable from the decoration you'll find in a mosque or the decoration in other Muslim buildings or manuscripts. And on the left, if we were to read it carefully and go to final pages, you would see Hebrew followed by Arabic, followed by Hebrew, followed by Arabic. Again, Jews living with their neighbors, learning, sharing. There's much more to learn from these, but I hope you've appreciated what I've shown you so far.
Dr. Kramer, thank you so much. I feel fortunate because I've seen a few of these things in real life, but just even seeing them, the digital images, it's fascinating. But why is it? We do have a couple questions, and
absolutely.
And one of them is it why is it so important to see the real thing in person?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, let me go back to some of the things that I showed our audience. The size, amongst many other qualities of the manuscripts, matters. So if you see a Haggadah and it will, fit in your hands on a table, you can tell that it's a personal copy of something. If, on the other hand, you've got that great machzor with the word melech that I emphasized the size of, you wouldn't appreciate that that's for communal purposes, to be put on a stand in the center of the synagogue. And what we can imagine, I mean, it's a huge book and it's very, very heavy. So the question is, how do you use this thing? Well, we've got to add to what I said before, is that a wealthy person paid to have it made for the community. And they wanted everybody to know that they made it, right? They wanted credit for this. So typically what would have happened, and we know this from a variety of sources, is they would have kept it at home, and then on the day of the holiday, they would have asked their servant to carry it into the synagogue, at which point it would very demonstratively be left out on the table. So it's that kind of thing. It's the quality of the parchment. It can be a brittle parchment or very fine, supple parchment. It's the nature of the writing, the gold. I mean, all of these things convey a sensibility that you can't just see from the images. What I would add to this is what I'm sure everyone in our audience recognizes. There's just a huge difference between seeing an image of the Last Supper and going to see the Last Supper in Milan.
Absolutely.
It's just not the same thing.
Milan any day.
Right, and the same thing is true here.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to see the images, but inspiration comes with being in the presence of something that was held by Jewish hands in Germany or in France in 1200, and we still have it here today. That's unbelievable.
And I know when I've seen several of the collections we have with the Haggadot,
right,
and you see the wine stains, and you see the food stains from hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
Exactly.
We're living the same
And unless
traditions.
you can see the wine stain, I mean, you imagine something that was produced like this with the gold, and they used it at the Seder table,
Right.
so it's got wine
Right.
stains. And if you can't see the wine stains, right? So if it's only reported about, or if you only see it, on an image that doesn't get to the details, you're missing something important.
Yeah, and you really, really get the insight that, the tradition we have and we house at the library is so precious.
Right.
Because of that.
Exactly.
So we do have another question. I think we have time for a couple more questions. And, the collection is vast. I mean, can you quantify what the
well, the
what's in the bare book room?
quantification is easy. We've got roughly 11,000 Hebrew manuscripts, as well as non-Hebrew, but roughly 11,000. I said before that this is the largest collection of rare Judaic in the world. What I mean by that is if you look at Hebrew manuscripts and rare Hebrew books in a single collection, right, there is no other collection that exceeds ours. So about 11,000 Hebrew manuscripts, 25,000 rare Hebrew printed books, and we've got many, many other. You saw the scroll example before, so there are many of these things. You know, I mean, it's an intimidating collection for someone like me. I mean, we've had through the years our experts, and they learn a lot, but there's always more to learn, and it's almost true. That whatever you take off the shelf, you're going to discover something surprising. And I've often done that, actually, as someone with the keys to the kingdom.
And right now, of course, since we are building the new Rare Book Room and the new library, people really cannot come in to see it, but fall 2019.
They're going to be able to come to see it. That's right. That's right. I mean, what I do have to emphasize is that most of the collection has been in storage during these years of transition of our building the new library. In the new library, we're going to have our exhibition space front and center. You walk in the front door, it's going to be right there. Our Rare Book Room is going to be right there. We've set aside a special room for presentations of our rare materials. But when we knew we were closing down for construction, we wanted to make sure that the kinds of things that I showed here, people would still have a chance to see the real thing. And so we have a relationship with the medieval department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We said to them, how about taking some of our gems, some of our jewels, and if you store them, and allow us to bring people to see them in your library from time to time, you can use what you choose for your exhibitions. And they are committed to reminding visitors when they come to the medieval department that while there were a lot of Christians who lived in Europe during the Middle Ages, there were also Jews.
Right.
And the way to demonstrate this is what survived from the Middle Ages with Jews representing Jewish culture was far more than anything else manuscripts. That means that the millions of visitors from all over the world who come to the Met have learned about medieval Jewish culture from our materials. And we're very, very proud of that.
And I think, I know that we're very proud of bringing our materials to libraries and museums all around the world.
Right.
And so a lot of our viewers out there and our congregants can see, probably in their own communities.
Often it's been in their communities. If you live in Detroit, we have a regular loan program to the Detroit Institute of the Arts. They, a number of years ago now, opened up wonderful new Islamic galleries, and they want to represent what the Jews living in Islamic lands produce. So we've been the regular source for those purposes. We loan literally all over the world. At this point, we've got loans in Berlin. We've had recent loans elsewhere in Germany and Italy. It never stops because people all over the world know the resources that we have.
Great. We have another question, too.
Yes.
And somebody had seen several years ago at the Jewish Museum here in New York our ketubah collection, which is astounding. Where can people see the ketubah collection when we reopen again?
Absolutely. Here I actually can say with great joy that for reasons of serendipity at its best, the first exhibit we're going to have in the new library will be devoted to our ketubot. The reason for that is because we have got the largest collection numerically of ketubot in a single library collection in the world. And we are finally, after years of work and difficulty finding proper publication means, with the opening of the new library, we are publishing a comprehensive catalog of our entire ketubah collection. And to celebrate that publication, we are at the same time going to have our inaugural exhibit, which will be devoted to our ketubot. So some of the ketubot will be available then, and we use them for showing at various times as well. I would add, if you have a good museum in your community that you might interest in this visually fantastic Jewish exhibit, we'd be happy to talk to them because it's an exhibit that we've loaned before of our outstanding ketubot.
And we do have another question.
Please.
Of all this vast collection, what is your favorite?
That's a hard one to answer, needless to say. I mean, some of the answer comes in what I chose for my presentation tonight, right? So there's a circularity there. I'm the kind of person who finds myself most excited by seeing something that surprises me, right? And the reason I like that is because if it surprises me, I know it's going to surprise somebody else. And when people come forth, with the wisdoms they learned in various places, I like to gently upset them, right? You thought that this is what traditional Jews looked like? Yeah, not so fast, right? And one of the things I've learned, I should really say this, one of the things I've learned from our collection is that people are people. People have always been people, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and what that means is we fight with one another, we fall in love with one another. I mean, we do all kinds of crazy things, so we've got examples from the Cairo Geniza. We've got the second largest collection of materials from the Cairo Geniza in the world. And what do we learn from these things? That rabbinic Jews and Karaite Jews who insulted one another, who hated one another, they were farther away from one another than our current, right and left in this country. Mm-hmm. And their insults didn't pale at all to some of the things that one might read on Twitter. But I've got to tell you, they married one another. And how do we know that? It was long assumed that they didn't. But we know that because we found ketubot, marriage contracts from the Cairo Geniza, which have Karaite and rabbinic Jews marrying one another. Another very interesting thing we learned from the Geniza and elsewhere is that how frequently everyone developed relations with everyone else, is the way to say it. So there's a great letter written by a woman to Maimonides' son. We have a lot of materials from Maimonides and his family in the Geniza, and the question goes like this. I met a Jewish merchant. I'm from Rome, right? We fell in love with one another. I converted. I came to Egypt, and now he's abandoned me for another woman. Right? So, Rabbi, how can you help me? Is basically what it says. But look at the complication of this story. We think that the life of, the pious everybody in the Middle Ages was much simpler, right? So the kinds of messiness that we see didn't exist. Yeah. One of the things you learn here is that humans are humans.
Humans are humans
and
throughout the
never
ages.
Going to escape messiness.
Right. Well, I think we are almost out of time. So I just want to thank you, Dr. David Kramer. And I want to thank all our friends of JTS and our congregants for participating in tonight's webinar and for your generous support of JTS throughout the year. This webinar has been taped, and the taped version will be available to you shortly.
And before you say goodnight, I want to reiterate the invitation. When we reopen, please look for us, and I would love to meet you. Tell me that you participated in this, and I promise I'll give you extra time.
Fall 2019. And for now, good night for JTS.